Turn this morning to somebody and just ask them the question, are you able?
Are you able? Are you able?
It's so easy to judge other people for what they say, for what they do. It's easy for us here in 2015 to sit back on our nice orange comfortable chairs at Living Faith Lutheran Church and point the finger at James and John and say, oh, what were they thinking? How could they possibly ask Jesus this question, this preposterous question? I mean, stop and think for a moment. If you've been following along in the gospel over the last couple of weeks, we have heard Jesus make his announcement, not once, not twice. Well, actually, it's been 3 times, except that the verses between last week and this week were omitted from the gospel text. And what is Jesus' announcement that he makes in the Gospel of Mark 3 times? His announcement is this: we are on the way. I am on the way. On the way to Jerusalem. On the way to the place, not where I'm going to be crowned with crowns and sit upon a throne, but rather where the authorities, the religious authorities in particular of the day, will come and bring charges against me. And after the charges, they will take me to court and bring me to the Roman court, and there will be torture and there will be pain, and eventually they will kill me. But on the 3rd day, I will rise. The first time Jesus said those words, you remember it was Peter who said, what? No way, Lord. Let it never be. This can never be. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, because you're thinking about things in the ways of the world. The second time Jesus says it in the next chapter, right after he finishes saying that, the disciples find themselves on the road, and you know what they're discussing, right? Who's the greatest among us, huh? Who's going to be in the highest place, huh? And each time it says to us by their actions, but even explicitly in words, they did not understand what Jesus was saying to them. And so here it is the 3rd time. Yes, we missed the words because we didn't read it in the lectionary text. But between last week's lesson and today, Jesus announced a 3rd time what is going to happen to him. And immediately upon that, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, come and say, we got a request for you. Can we just talk a moment about where things are going to be at? And we wanted to just ask you a question. Do you join with me? I hate when somebody comes and asks me a question and wants me to promise I'm going to answer the way they want to hear, even without them having asked the question, you know? That's just a pet peeve of mine. Don't ask me to commit to the answer you want when you haven't even asked the question. But that's exactly what they do, right? They come and they ask Jesus, we want you to promise us something, huh? We want you to make us a promise for the future. And Jesus said, so what is it that you want to know? And then they ask their question. Will you allow us to sit one at your right and one at your left? And here we sit today and we want to judge them, saying, how could they? Well, we're in good shape to judge them, right? Because the 10 disciples got real angry at them too, right? So we can do that, right? We can point at Jesus, at James and John and say, how dare you ask that question? But you know what they say when you point at somebody, right? You got those 3 other fingers that are pointing right back at you. What are we in a position to question James and John? We know better, right? I mean, they were being told about Jesus' journey to the cross and about his resurrection, and they didn't understand. But we can understand why they didn't understand. Can we understand how come we live like we don't understand? Oh, we say we believe, but do our actions live it out? I listened yesterday to the entire message of Dr. Martin Luther King, entitled The Drum Major Instinct. It was the last sermon that he preached to his congregation at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta 2 months before he was killed in Memphis. It turns out that his sermon was based on the exact same text that we have just read this morning. And in that he talks about the drum major instinct. And you know what an instinct is? Right? We tend to think of animals as having instincts because we're above that, right? But an instinct is something that we do naturally. We don't stop and think about it. It comes to us naturally. And so he talks about the drum major instinct as being that instinct within each of us that comes naturally that says what? I want the best place. I want to be in the highest position. I want the best job, the biggest paying job. I want the biggest house, the nicest car. We want all the things that will make us feel good, will make us feel like we are the drum major, like we are in charge of this thing called life. How many of you know that we're not? And so he says people live and act in a way, we want somebody. Can you reach over here for a second, Ken? Just pat me on the shoulder. Oh, thank you so much. We want to pick up our praise wherever we can, whether or not it's deserved. We want to get somebody to say something good about us. In fact, the only time we get upset about something good being said is it's being said about somebody other than ourselves. Huh? And Martin Luther King goes on in his sermon to talk about how people are trying to get things that are above and beyond their actual reach. Now, it was interesting, if you take the time to listen to it, and if you Google drum major instinct, you can hear the whole thing. It was only 38 minutes long, Don. That's all. Is that enough time for me to share that sermon? And in that sermon, he talks about, in 1968 economics, about people buying cars, spending as much as $5,000 for a brand new car. Oh, man. Today you'd be lucky to find one that moves for $5,000, right? But he talked about the principle of saying that really you should be paying for your car no more than half of what your annual salary is. And so the percentage numbers actually still work, even if the dollar figures to us seem ludicrous. We spend 5 times and 6 times as much for a basic car now, right? But he says, in order to make it, he says, when you go above that, when you spend more than that on a vehicle, and the same is true of a house, but with a different percentage. He said, you're driving and you should be thinking about, a decent car that'll get you from one place to another, but instead you want a Cadillac, huh? You want a Mercedes. You want a Lexus. Okay, some of those cars didn't even exist when he was driving, when he was around. And you want that, and then what happens is you're making payments, or trying to. You can't keep up. Maybe you make the payment on your car because you know they'll come and take it, but then how are you going to pay for food? What does it look like when you show up at the food pantry driving a Mercedes? Huh? There's something wrong with the picture. Something hasn't worked out altogether right. And he says, but what we need to do is find ourselves in a place where we can afford what we can achieve and move towards that. Not that we shouldn't shoot for the highest and the best. And you know what he ends up saying? If you haven't heard the sermon before, you really should take a moment to listen for it, because he ends up saying that if he was to be called a drum major, he wanted to be called a drum major for justice. He wanted to be called the one who led the way and led the force for people to move into a better world and to find ourselves in a better world. And he said that is something that we should always strive for. And if somebody should say something about us, they should say, we strove to make a difference in the world. I gave it away, my picture of President Carter and Rosalind Carter. 5 million families have been affected by the homes that have been built by Habitat for Humanity. Do you think the world is a better place for those people? And what about we ourselves? We have the opportunity to make this world a better place. And when Jesus asked the question of James and John, he asked them this question in response to their preposterous question. He tells them what they can expect. The baptism that he is going to go through, the cup which he is going to drink. If you fast forward in the text a little bit further, you remember him asking God the Father, let this cup pass from me. Even Jesus didn't want to go through with that. But he asked James and John, are you able to drink this cup? And they have the guts to say, we are able. What's the difference between ableness and ability? Ability, I think, is what you train for. You train probably in the area that you feel as your call, as your vocation, the things that you feel strong in. You say, this is what I feel, when you ask the child, what do you want to be when you grow up? And of course, first they all want to be presidents and astronauts, right? But as the time goes on, reality comes and they have some more realistic things. And by the time they're in high school, hopefully, right, they're saying some things that are very realistic. This is what I want to become. They're following their call, their vocation. And so they do the training. Well, let's take somebody who becomes a fireman or a firewoman, for example, who goes through the academy and does all the training, learns all the techniques, learns all the equipment, knows how to use all of this equipment in order to become a firefighter. They have the ability. They've been tested for the ability. Do they have the ableness? Do they have the ableness is the question that comes when they're at the scene of the fire. And they're ready to do what they have been trained to do. Their ability is ready. But now it's a matter of going into a burning building and possibly saving somebody inside and fighting that fire. That takes something more than just ability. That takes something that comes from the Spirit of God that inspires you and infuses you to say, now take your ability and be able to carry out what God has called you to do. I had an experience as a chaplain with hospice. I was visiting with a woman. It was my first visit with her, actually, who was clearly getting ready to make her final transition from this life. Her daughter was there with her and the daughter's boyfriend. And so as we came, as we shared together, as we prayed together, as we invited God's Spirit and God's presence into the room together, her boyfriend said to me, I could never do what you do. And I looked at him and I said, I said, what do you do? He says, well, I was a fireman. And I said, really? He told me that he was appointed as the person who sits at the back end of the hook and ladder truck. Right? So picture that with me if you know a hook and ladder truck, right? So the back end up on the top, there's another steering wheel so that the hook and ladder truck, which is long, can make it around those corners, and the guy in the back has to steer. And you know what? He has to steer counterintuitively, because he has to steer in the opposite direction of where they're going to go, for the wheels to turn the right way in the back, for the end of the truck to go and make it down the corner. One day after a storm, they had a call. And with the sirens going, in the dark, They were racing down a street, and the driver in the front didn't realize that there was a wire that had dropped down. And the wire had dropped down to a point that was high enough still for the engine to go through, and for the rest of the truck to go through. But it was not so low that it didn't capture the cab that he was sitting in the back. And that wire wrapped itself around that cab and ripped it off the back of the truck with him still inside. And so that was his last day as an active firefighter. That he was telling me about it was a miracle. That he survived was incredible. And I looked at him and I said, and you say to me, you could never do what I do? I would never be able to do what he does. Or at that point, what he did. But you need to have something within you to be able to say, God, I have the ability. Now give me the ableness, which is the Spirit of God come within. One more story and I close. There is an angel living in Weston. Why Weston, you say? Because some of us have visited where Karen Albanese has been living these last 6 months. At the West Villa del Lago in Weston. It's a private house. If you drove by the front of it, it would look no different than any other house. But there, Una Miller owns the house, and she serves a number of residents at as an assisted living facility. And there she has received Karen with her whole heart as one of her residents. And because of Karen's Alzheimer's and the situation that she was facing, it was a difficult transition. And Una, with her nursing background and with all her ability, found that in order to get Karen to feel welcome and comfortable there, that she had to give her really special attention. And by really special attention, I mean they became so close that for nighttime to come, Una would actually sleep in the bed with Karen and hold her. And she says to this day now, Karen calls her Mama. This week, actually yesterday, Una went to the care center where they've transferred Karen at Memorial South Hospital. And she called and she was crying. She says, I don't know if I'm able to keep on caring for her. I don't know if it's within me. And I don't even know if she's going to come back to me. So we're praying together. We pray that God would take her ability and also make her able to care for Karen, able to care for Bobby, as we as a church have done in these last months together, to care for both of them and to care for Una as well. Even to care for her enough that if Karen doesn't get to come back, that she'll be able to receive God's gift of strength to make it possible. And you know, folks, when we can say that, when we can get to the point that we turn all our abilities over to God, and it's no longer about what I can get or who I can be, but just as a servant of God. And we get to that point, and it's just a question of, will I, Lord, be able? Then the only thing that we can say is, precious Lord, take my hand, lead